When the predator bowed. In 43 years of living alone in the Idaho wilderness, Silas had seen a lot of things that defied explanation. But he'd never seen this. A white wolf, rarest creature in these mountains, standing on his porch in the middle of a January blizzard. Not running, not attacking, just standing there, shaking from something that went deeper than cold. And then it did something that made Silas's blood freeze in his veins. It lifted one small paw and placed it on his boot. Gentle, deliberate, the way a dog begs, the way something asks for help when words have run out and all that's left is desperate faith in a stranger's mercy. Blood stained the weathered wood beneath that paw, fresh blood that steamed in the 8 below air. The wolf's eyes held something Silas recognized from his own mirror. Something human. Something that shouldn't exist in a wild predator's gaze. Desperation. Not for food. Not for shelter. For a miracle. What Silas didn't know, standing there with his hand on the door and his heart hammering against his ribs, was that following this creature into the frozen mountains would lead him to something worse than death, would force him to face a truth about cruelty and devotion that would shatter everything he thought he understood about the thin line between man and beast, would make him choose between saving his own life and honoring a promise he hadn't even made yet. The wolf turned toward the tree line, toward the darkness, toward Devil's Canyon where things went to die and rarely came back. Then it looked back at him, waiting. And Silas, old and broken and alone in ways that had nothing to do with geography, made a choice that would change everything. He reached for his coat. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but Silas kept his fingers wrapped around the chipped mugs anyway. Outside the cabin window, Idaho's January wind rattled the panes like it wanted inside, wanted to freeze everything it touched. The thermometer nailed to the porch post read 8 below. He didn't need to look at it. After 43 years in these mountains, cold had a taste. Metallic, sharp enough to cut. Jasper lifted his gray muzzle from the braided rug by the wood stove. The old hound's ears twitched once, then flattened. Something was wrong. Silas knew that look. It was the same expression Jasper wore 3 years ago when Margaret stopped breathing in the bedroom upstairs, when the cabin fell silent in a way that never quite lifted. The dog moved to the window, slow and stiff on arthritic legs. A low sound rolled from his chest, not a bark. Deeper, quieter, the kind of warning that meant business. Silas set down the mug and reached for his glasses. The world beyond the frost-glazed glass sharpened into focus. Snow. More snow. The skeletal arms of lodgepole pines bending under the weight of it. Then he saw the shape. Small, white against white. Moving wrong, not the loping confidence of a coyote or the cautious creep of a fox. This thing stumbled, fell, dragged itself forward through drifts that came up to its chest. Silas's first thought was dog. Some fool tourist's pet wandered off from a vacation rental down in Ketchum. But as the shape drew closer, recognition settled in his gut like a stone. Wolf, a white one, rare as hen's teeth in this part of Idaho. The kind of animal that made biologists pack up their equipment and drive 6 hours just for a glimpse. Silas had seen exactly 2 in his lifetime, both times at a distance. Both times through a rifle scope he never pulled the trigger on, though he could have. Should have, maybe, back in the days when the ranchers pooled money for wolf pelts and didn't ask questions. This one was young, barely past pup stage. Its coat should have been pristine, but even through the falling snow, Silas could see the dark streaks matting its fur. Blood, probably, or mud, maybe both. The wolf stopped 10 yards from the porch. Its sides heaved. Steam rose from its open mouth. For a long moment, it simply stood there in the dying light, staring at the cabin. At him. Jasper growled again, but he didn't lunge at the door, didn't bare his teeth. The old hound just watched, and something in his posture had shifted. Silas had hunted with this dog for 12 years. He knew every signal, every mood. This wasn't aggression. This was curiosity, maybe even concern. The wolf took another step, then another. It moved like each footfall cost something. When it reached the bottom of the porch steps, it sat. Deliberate, purposeful. The way a dog sits when it's been taught to wait for permission. Silas's hand found the doorknob before his brain caught up with his body. Margaret used to tell him he had a savior complex. "You can't rescue everything that limps past our door, Si," she'd said once, years ago, after he'd brought home a half-dead barn owl and tried to nurse it back to health in their bathtub. The owl had died anyway. They usually did. He opened the door. Cold air knifed through his flannel shirt. The wolf didn't run, didn't even flinch. It just looked up at him with eyes that held something Silas recognized. Something human almost. Desperation. Not the animal kind. Not the simple need for food or shelter. This was bigger. This was a plea that went beyond instinct, beyond survival. This was a creature asking for a miracle it had no right to expect, but couldn't stop hoping for anyway. Silas had seen that look before, in the mirror, every morning since Margaret's funeral. "Well," he said quietly, his breath fogging in the frozen air. "Hell." The wolf stood. It climbed the first step, then the second. Its right front paw left a smear of red on the weathered wood. Not a lot, but just enough. When it reached the top, it didn't go for the door. Instead, it pressed its small paw against Silas's boot. Just once. A touch so light it might have been imagined. Then it turned and looked back toward the tree line. Toward the dark wall of forest and stone that climbed into the mountains. Toward whatever it had come from. Toward whatever was waiting up there in the cold and the dark. Silas expected the wolf to bolt. Every instinct bred into a wild thing should have sent it running the moment a human got this close. But the young wolf just stood there on his porch, trembling, waiting. Behind him, Jasper's claws clicked against the floorboards. The old hound moved past Silas's legs, slow and deliberate, until he stood between the man and the wolf. This was it. The moment that should end with snarling and blood. Silas had seen Jasper tree cougars, run down coyotes, hold a wounded black bear at bay until help arrived. The dog had wolf in his own lineage somewhere back in the genetic soup, but he'd spent his whole life on the other side of that ancient war. The wolf lowered its head, not in submission. Something else. Something that made Silas's chest tighten. Jasper sniffed the air. His tail, usually stiff and suspicious around predators, hung loose, almost relaxed. He took a step closer to the wolf, then another. The distance between them closed to inches. The young wolf didn't move, its blue eyes fixed on Jasper with an intensity that seemed to bypass everything animal and land somewhere deeper. Somewhere that remembered when dogs and wolves were the same thing, before humans drew the line between domestic and wild. Then Jasper did something Silas had never seen in 12 years. The old hound lowered his gray muzzle and touched his nose to the wolf's forehead. Gentle, careful, the kind of touch reserved for puppies and sick things. The wolf's eyes closed. Its whole body seemed to sag with relief. When Jasper's tongue flicked out and licked the wolf's torn ear, Silas felt something crack open inside his chest. Some wall he'd built after Margaret died. After the silence in the cabin became a third presence he couldn't shake. He'd forgotten what it looked like when two creatures recognized each other's pain. when the labels fell away, and all that remained was the raw truth that suffering speaks a universal language. The wolf opened its eyes and looked at Silas again. That same desperate plea. But now Jasper stood beside it, lending credibility to whatever impossible request hung in the frozen air between them. Silas crouched down, his knees protesting with sharp pops that reminded him he was 71 and had no business getting involved in whatever this was. Up close, he could see the wolf better. The bloodstains weren't on its body. They were on its paws, fresh enough to still be damp. It had traveled through something bad to get here. "You came a long way," Silas said quietly. His voice sounded strange. He hadn't spoken out loud to anything but Jasper in days, maybe weeks. "Didn't you?" The wolf's response came in a way that bypassed language entirely. It lifted that same right paw, the one with blood on it, and placed it against Silas's palm. The touch was feather light, deliberate, a handshake between species that should have been enemies. Silas's throat tightened. He'd spent 40 years in these mountains. He'd tracked wounded elk through blizzards, pulled fishing hooks from the throats of pelicans, once helped a pregnant moose who'd gotten tangled in barbed wire. But he'd never had a wild animal ask him for help. Not like this. Not with this kind of clarity. The wolf pulled its paw back and turned toward the forest again. It took 3 steps, then stopped. Looked back. The message couldn't have been clearer if it had spoken English. "Follow me." "Absolutely not," Silas said. But he was already doing the math in his head. The temperature was dropping, would hit 20 below by midnight. Whatever was up there in those mountains, it wouldn't survive much longer. And this young wolf, barely old enough to hunt on its own, had somehow found the intelligence to seek help from the one creature that might be able to provide it. Jasper made a soft sound. Not quite a whine. More like a question. The old hound looked at Silas, then at the wolf, then back again, asking permission, offering partnership. Silas straightened up, his back complaining every inch of the way. Through the window, he could see his rifle mounted above the fireplace, his medical kit on the shelf by the door, his heavy coat hanging on its peg, everything he'd need for something monumentally stupid. Margaret's voice echoed in his memory. "Your heart's too big for your common sense, Si." "Yeah," he muttered. "I know." The wolf waited, patient, trusting in a way that wild things shouldn't trust. Jasper sat down beside it, and for just a moment, in the gathering dark, they looked like partners. Brothers, almost. 2 creatures who understood that sometimes the only way to survive the cold was to forget who you were supposed to be afraid of. Silas looked at them both. At the blood on the wolf's paws, at the plea in its eyes, at Jasper's calm acceptance of something that should have been impossible. "All right," he said finally. "Show me." The coat smelled like mothballs and old sweat. Silas hadn't worn it in 2 years, not since the last time he'd ventured beyond the tree line. It hung heavier than he remembered, or maybe his shoulders had just gotten weaker. He cinched the belt tight and reached for the medical kit on the shelf. The canvas bag was military surplus, older than most of the trees on his property. Inside, gauze, antiseptic, a suture kit he'd used exactly 3 times, all on himself. The rifle came last, a Winchester Model 70 that had belonged to his father. Silas told himself it was just for safety. Mountain lions. Maybe a bear if one had woken up early from hibernation. But his hands knew the truth as they loaded the chamber. There were worse predators than animals in these mountains. The humankind. Jasper waited by the door, patient as stone. The young wolf had already disappeared into the darkness beyond the porch light, a white ghost swallowed by shadows and falling snow. For a moment, Silas wondered if he'd imagined the whole thing. If grief and isolation had finally cracked something important in his head. Then he saw the blood on his porch. Real, dark, freezing into the wood grain. He stepped out into the cold, and the wolf materialized from the tree line, waiting. Its eyes caught the light from the cabin window and threw it back at him. Twin coins of reflected hope. They moved into the forest together. The wolf led. Jasper followed. Silas brought up the rear, already feeling the bite of cold air in his lungs. The snow was deep here, untouched by human feet since the last storm. Each step took effort. Each breath came a little harder than the last. The wolf moved with purpose, picking a path that angled upward into the high country, toward Devil's Canyon. Silas recognized the route, even in the dark. He'd hunted these trails 40 years ago, before the Forest Service declared the area too dangerous for public access. The canyon earned its name honestly. Vertical rock faces that no sane person climbed, wind that funneled through the narrows with enough force to knock a grown man off his feet. In winter, it became something worse. A frozen hell where the temperature could drop 30 degrees in an hour and avalanches erased entire mountainsides. "We're not really going up there," Silas said to no one in particular. But his boots kept moving, one foot in front of the other, following a wolf pup into terrain that had killed better men than him. The trees thinned as they climbed. Lodgepole pine gave way to twisted whitebark that grew sideways from the constant wind. The ground turned to exposed rock and ice. Silas's knees started their familiar protest, a grinding ache that radiated up into his hips. Arthritis. The doctor in Ketchum had given him pills for it. They sat in a bottle on his bathroom counter, untouched. Margaret used to nag him about taking them. Nobody nagged him anymore. The wolf stopped at a narrow gap between two boulders. It looked back at Silas, then at the passage ahead. The message was clear. This was the only way forward. Silas squeezed through, the stones scraping his shoulders even through the heavy coat. His breath came in ragged pulls now. The altitude was getting to him. They had to be close to 8,000 feet. His cabin sat at 6,500. The difference might not sound like much, but his lungs knew better. On the other side of the gap, the land opened into the beginning of the canyon proper. Sheer walls rose on both sides, disappearing into the darkness above. The wind hit him like a physical thing, howling through the narrow space with a sound that could pass for human voices if you let your imagination run. Silas had heard stories about this place. Old Shoshone legends about spirits trapped in the stone. He'd always dismissed them as superstition. Tonight, he wasn't so sure. The wolf pressed on, unbothered by the wind. Its small body cut through the gusts like they were nothing. Youth and desperation made for powerful fuel. Jasper struggled more, his old legs slipping on patches of ice. Silas wanted to stop, wanted to turn back. His whole body screamed for warmth and rest. Then the wolf stopped again. It sat down in the snow and turned its head, those blue eyes finding Silas in the dark. There was something in that gaze, not just urgency, something deeper, a kind of faith that seemed impossible from a creature that should fear him. It believed he would follow, believed he could help, believed in him more than he'd believed in himself for 3 long years. Silas's throat tightened. He thought about Margaret, about the way she used to look at him when he came home with another wounded animal, that mix of exasperation and love. "You old fool," she'd say. But she'd always helped him anyway, always believed that saving one small thing mattered. The wolf stood and continued up the canyon. Silas followed, his exhaustion pushed back by something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was purpose. Maybe it was just the stubborn refusal to let down something that trusted him. Either way, he kept walking. The cave mouth appeared as a darker shadow against the canyon wall. Easy to miss if you didn't know what to look for. The young wolf stopped at the entrance and turned back one last time. Its whole body trembled now. Not from cold, but from something else. Fear, maybe. Or the awful knowledge of what Silas was about to see. Silas pulled the flashlight from his coat pocket. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating rough stone walls that narrowed into a tunnel barely wide enough for a man. He had to crouch to enter, his back screaming in protest. Jasper pressed close to his leg, and together they moved deeper into the mountain's throat. The smell hit him first. Blood and waste and something else. The sharp, metallic scent of fear that soaks into stone when an animal has been dying slowly. Silas had smelled it before. On battlefields in Korea, in hospitals, in the bedroom upstairs where Margaret had spent her last 3 months. The tunnel opened into a small chamber. The flashlight beam found her immediately. The mother wolf lay at the far end of the cave, her white coat matted and filthy. But it was her rear leg that made Silas's stomach drop. The bear trap had closed around it just above the ankle, its rusted steel jaws buried deep in flesh and bone. The kind of trap that had been illegal in Idaho for 20 years. The kind trappers used to hide in the woods and forget about, leaving them to rot and catch whatever stumbled into them. The snow around her was destroyed, churned into a frozen wasteland of red and brown where she'd thrashed and fought and tried to escape. Deep gouges marked the stone walls where her claws had scraped. She'd been here for days, maybe a week, fighting the trap, fighting death, fighting to stay alive for the pup that needed her. And when fighting hadn't worked, she'd tried the only option left. The evidence lay scattered around her. Tufts of white fur torn from her own leg. Teeth marks in her own flesh where she'd tried to gnaw through bone and sinew to free herself. The ancient, terrible calculus that animals understood better than humans. Better to lose the leg than die with it. But she hadn't been strong enough. The trap had won. Her head lifted when the flashlight found her eyes. Silas expected to see rage there, the wild fury of a cornered predator. Instead, he saw something that made his chest feel like it was being crushed in its own steel trap. Surrender. Not the surrender of giving up. The surrender of a mother who'd fought every battle she could and lost them all. Who'd sent her baby into the night hoping for a miracle, because miracles were all she had left. Her eyes held no aggression, no threat, just a terrible, aching plea. Save my child. The young wolf moved past Silas, crawling on its belly to its mother's side. It pressed its small body against her neck, making soft sounds that bypassed language entirely. Comfort, reassurance, the promise that help had come, even if it was too late. The mother wolf turned her muzzle and touched her pup's face with her nose. Gentle, tender, a gesture so human in its love that Silas had to look away for a moment. His vision blurred. He told himself it was the cold making his eyes water. He'd seen cruelty before. Men did terrible things to each other in war. Nature did terrible things as a matter of course. But this felt different. This was intentional human cruelty meeting animal devotion, and the contrast made him sick. Silas set down his rifle and moved closer, slow and careful. The mother wolf watched him come but didn't growl, didn't bare her teeth. She'd moved beyond fear into some other territory, a place where death waited patiently and the only question left was whether her pup would survive it. He knelt beside the trap, his knees cracking loud in the confined space. Up close, it looked even worse. The steel had cut through fur and skin and muscle. Infection had set in, turning the wound putrid. The leg was ruined. Even if he could free her, even if they made it down the mountain, she'd never run again, never hunt, never live as a wolf was meant to live. But she might live. That was something. Silas's hands hovered over the trap mechanism. It was old, the release spring probably seized from years of rust and weather. He'd need both hands to pry it open, would need to work fast once it gave, because the pain would be unimaginable. The mother wolf's eyes found his, held them. In that moment, Silas understood something that couldn't be spoken. She knew this was going to hurt worse than anything that had come before. Knew she might not survive it. But she also knew her pup stood a better chance if she trusted this strange human with the gentle hands and the old dog who'd licked her baby's wounds. So she lay still, waiting, trusting, offering her broken body up to whatever came next, because it was the only gift she had left to give. Silas's throat worked around words that wouldn't come. He thought about Margaret again, about the way she'd looked at him near the end, when the pain got so bad the morphine barely touched it. "Do what you have to do, Si," she'd whispered. "Just don't leave me alone." He hadn't. He'd held her hand through every needle, every procedure, every moment of agony. He'd stayed until her last breath, and then he'd stayed longer, unable to let go of her fingers even when they'd turned cold. "I'm not leaving you," he said to the wolf. His voice came out rough, broken. "I'm going to get you out of this. I swear to God, I'm getting you out." Silas reached for the trap's release mechanism, then stopped. Something felt wrong. The kind of wrong that came from 40 years of reading mountains the way other men read newspapers. He played the flashlight beam across the cave floor, looking for what his instincts had already sensed. There, near the entrance, a partial boot print in the thin layer of snow that had blown into the cave mouth, fresh enough that the edges hadn't softened. The tread pattern was distinct. Vibram's soles, expensive hunting boots, not his, not anyone who'd been here before tonight. Silas's blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. He moved to the cave entrance, keeping low. Outside, the wind had eased enough to see clearly in the moonlight. More tracks, a line of them leading up to a cluster of boulders about 50 yards away. Whoever made them had stood there for a while, watching, waiting. The snow around the spot was trampled and stained yellow where someone had relieved themselves. They'd been there recently, within the last hour. Silas knew these mountains, knew that nobody came up to Devil's Canyon in January by accident. Nobody except someone looking for something specific, something valuable enough to risk frostbite and worse. A white wolf pelt could fetch $5,000 from the right buyer. Maybe more if you knew where to look. The kind of money that made men do stupid things, illegal things. The kind of money that had corrupted Caleb Morrison 20 years ago. The name hit Silas like a fist to the gut. He hadn't thought about Caleb in years, had hoped the man had moved away or died or found Jesus. But men like Caleb didn't change. They just got meaner and more desperate as the years stripped away whatever conscience they'd started with. Silas had worked with Caleb back in the 80s, before the younger man got fired from the Forest Service for taking bribes from logging companies. They'd been friends once, or something close to it. Had shared coffee in fire towers and swapped stories about close calls with grizzlies. Then Silas caught him setting illegal traps on protected land. Turned him in. Did the right thing. Caleb had spent 6 months in county jail. lost his pension, lost everything. He'd promised Silas he'd pay him back for that someday. Promised it with eyes that held the kind of hate that doesn't fade with time. Now he was out there in the dark, tracking the same white wolf. Probably had been for days, following the pup's desperate journey down the mountain, waiting for it to lead him to the mother, to the real prize. Silas's hands tightened on his rifle. The smart thing would be to leave. Get out while he still could. Let Caleb have his bloody prize and walk away clean. Silas was 71 years old. Too old for this kind of trouble. Too tired to fight wars that weren't his. But when he looked back into the cave, he saw the mother wolf's eyes watching him, trusting him. The pup curled against her, so small and fragile that it could fit in Silas's coat pocket. Margaret's voice echoed in his memory. Not the tired, pain-hollowed voice from the end, but the strong one from their early years. You've never walked away from something just because it was hard, Si. Don't start now. Silas checked his watch. Nearly midnight. Caleb would wait for first light to make his move, would want to see clearly when he came for the wolf. That gave Silas maybe 5 hours. 5 hours to free the mother wolf, stabilize her, and figure out how to get her down the mountain before Caleb showed up with whatever weapon he'd brought for the job. It wasn't enough time. Not even close. But it was what he had. Silas moved back into the cave, his mind already working through the possibilities. He couldn't take Caleb in a fight. The man was 20 years younger and mean as a snake. But Silas knew these mountains better. Knew the hidden trails and the places where the stone played tricks with sound. Knew how to make a man think he had the advantage right up until the moment he didn't. First, though, he had to free the wolf. Had to do it quietly, without lights that would broadcast his position to anyone watching from the ridge above. Had to work fast and precise in near total darkness, while an injured predator lay inches from his hands. The impossibility of it settled over him like the weight of the mountain itself. Jasper moved to the cave entrance and sat down, his body blocking the opening. The old hound's ears were up, alert. He'd sensed the danger too. Understood that something out there in the dark meant harm. He positioned himself as a living shield, ready to sound the alarm if anything approached. The young wolf watched from beside its mother, those blue eyes reflecting the faint moonlight that filtered into the cave. It had brought Silas here, had trusted him with its mother's life, had no way of knowing that in doing so, it might have led them all into a trap. Silas pulled off his gloves and flexed his fingers. They ached from the cold. But they'd have to do. He couldn't work the trap mechanism with gloves on. Couldn't feel the rusted metal and frozen springs. He positioned himself beside the mother wolf again. Her breathing had gotten shallower, more labored. She was fading, running out of time even without Caleb's threat hanging over them. All right, Silas whispered, to the wolf, to himself, to whatever God might be listening in this frozen hell. Let's see if an old man still got any fight left in him. Silas wedged the flashlight between two rocks, angling it to illuminate the trap without casting his shadow across the work area. The beam threw harsh contrasts across the cave walls, turning everything into edges and darkness. His medical kit lay open beside him, but he already knew most of what was inside would be useless here. Gauze and antiseptic cream meant for scraped knees and shallow cuts. Nothing designed for this kind of damage. He pulled out the flask from his inner coat pocket. Good Kentucky bourbon that Margaret had given him on their 40th anniversary. He'd been saving it for something. He just never figured that something would be field surgery on a dying wolf, while a man with murder in his heart waited somewhere in the dark outside. Silas unscrewed the cap and poured a measure over his hands. The alcohol burned against his cracked skin, but it was the closest thing to sterile he could manage. He poured more over the trap mechanism, watching the amber liquid run into the rusted joints. Maybe it would help. Maybe it wouldn't. He was making this up as he went. The mother wolf's eyes tracked his every movement. She knew what was coming. Animals always knew. They understood pain in a way that bypassed thought and landed somewhere deeper, somewhere that humans had forgotten how to access. Her body tensed, muscles coiling beneath matted fur. "Easy," Silas murmured. "Easy now." His fingers found the trap's release lever. It was frozen solid, the mechanism seized after years of weather and neglect. He'd need both hands, would need to put his full weight into it. And when it released, the jaws would spring open with whatever force the old springs still had left in them. The wolf's leg would come free, but the sudden movement would tear through damaged tissue like fire through dry timber. She would scream. They always did. Silas positioned himself, bracing his boots against the stone floor for leverage. The young pup seemed to understand that something terrible was about to happen. It crawled across its mother's body, settling over her chest and neck, providing warmth, providing weight to help hold her down when the pain hit. The gesture was so deliberate, so knowing, that Silas had to blink hard against the burning in his eyes. At the cave entrance, Jasper shifted position. The old hound's growl started low in his chest, a sound Silas felt more than heard. Something was moving out there. Maybe just the wind. Maybe not. No time left for hesitation. Silas gripped the lever with both hands. The cold metal burned against his bare skin. He pulled. Nothing. The mechanism held fast, frozen and stubborn. He repositioned, planting his feet wider, and pulled again. The muscles in his back protested. His shoulders shook with effort. Age and arthritis made his grip weaken, slip. He thought about giving up, about walking away before Caleb showed up, about saving himself from a fight he couldn't win and a task he couldn't complete. The smart choice, the safe choice. Then the mother wolf made a sound. Not a growl or a whine, but something softer. A sound that mothers made in every language, across every species. The sound of someone trying to be brave for their child, even when bravery had run out. Silas set his jaw and pulled with everything he had left. Something in the mechanism shifted. A tiny give. Rust flaking away. He adjusted his grip, ignored the way his hands screamed, and threw his whole weight backward. The lever moved, an inch, then another, metal grinding against metal with a sound like teeth on bone. The mother wolf's body went rigid. The pup pressed itself flat against her, sharing her pain the only way it knew how. One more pull, one more moment of strength from a body that had nothing left to give. Silas's vision blurred at the edges. His heart hammered against his ribs. His hands were bleeding now, skin torn on the rough metal, but he didn't let go. The trap's jaws opened with a sound like a gunshot in the confined space. The mother wolf's cry echoed off the stone walls. Raw, primal, the sound of agony given voice. Her body convulsed, trying to jerk away from the source of pain. But the pup's weight held her partially down. Blood welled from the wound, dark and thick in the flashlight beam. Silas moved fast, years of hunting experience taking over. He poured bourbon directly onto the mangled leg, not caring about waste. The wolf thrashed, her jaws snapping at air, at nothing, at the pain that consumed everything. He grabbed gauze from the medical kit and packed it against the worst of the bleeding, applying pressure with hands that had steadied now that action had replaced thought. The pup stayed in place, trembling but determined. Its small body absorbed its mother's convulsions, keeping her from doing more damage to herself. At the cave entrance, Jasper's growl intensified. Not a warning anymore. An announcement. Company was coming. Silas worked faster. More gauze, more pressure. The bleeding slowed but didn't stop. The leg was ruined. Bone showed white through torn muscle. Even if they survived this night, even if they made it down the mountain, this wolf would never run free again. But she might live. She might watch her pup grow strong, might teach it to hunt and survive, even from 3 legs instead of 4. Life didn't have to be perfect to be worth living. Margaret had taught him that. He wrapped the leg as tight as he dared, using every scrap of bandage in his kit. His hands left blood smears on the white gauze. His blood, her blood, all mixed together now. Outside, a sound cut through the wind. Footsteps crunching on frozen snow. Getting closer. The footsteps stopped just beyond the cave entrance. Silas held his breath, one hand on his rifle. Jasper stood rigid, hackles raised along his spine. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. Nothing moved. Then the footsteps retreated, crunching back down the slope they'd come from. Caleb was smart enough to wait. Smart enough to know that approaching an armed man in a confined space was suicide, even if that man was old. He'd bide his time, watch from a distance, wait for Silas to make a mistake, or for exhaustion to do what a bullet couldn't. The wind picked up outside, howling through the canyon with renewed fury. Snow began to fall harder, visible even in the darkness. A storm was rolling in, the kind that turned the mountains into a white grave for anyone stupid enough to be caught exposed. Silas looked at the unconscious wolf, then at the storm building outside. They weren't going anywhere. Not tonight. Maybe not for days if this storm settled in the way Idaho storms like to do. He was trapped in a cave with a dying animal, waiting for a man who wanted them both dead. He should have felt afraid. Should have been calculating odds and planning escapes. Instead, he felt something unexpected. Relief. For the first time in 3 years, he had a purpose that extended beyond the next meal or the next sunrise. He was needed. That simple fact mattered more than the danger. Silas gathered what dry wood he could find in the cave. Old branches that had blown in over the years and desiccated to perfect kindling. He built a small fire near the entrance, careful to keep the smoke thin and the light dim. Enough to provide warmth, not enough to broadcast their position to anyone watching from the ridges above. The flames took hold, casting dancing shadows across the stone walls. The cave transformed from a tomb into something almost cozy. The young pup crawled closer to the fire, drawn by heat it probably hadn't felt since leaving the den. Its fur was matted with its mother's blood, but its eyes remained bright, hopeful, trusting that the strange human who'd freed its mother could somehow make everything right. The mother wolf lay still, her breathing shallow but steady. The bourbon and shock had knocked her into unconsciousness. Probably better that way. The body had its own wisdom about when to shut down, when pain became too much for consciousness to bear. Silas had seen it in Korea, seen it with Margaret. The mercy of oblivion. He settled himself against the cave wall, close enough to the fire to feel its warmth, but far enough to keep watch on both entrances. Jasper curled up beside him, the old dog's weight a comfort against his leg. The pup watched them both, uncertain whether to stay with its mother or join this strange pack that had formed in the firelight. Silas patted the ground beside him. The pup hesitated, then crept forward. It settled against his other side, small and trembling. Sandwiched between dog and wolf, Silas felt something in his chest loosen. Something that had been clenched tight since the day he'd buried Margaret in the cemetery down in Ketchum. "You know," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse, "I used to talk to myself all the time. Margaret said it was a sign of intelligence. Then she'd laugh and say it was also a sign of crazy. He smiled at the memory. Guess she was right on both counts. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind screamed. But inside the cave, warmth and stillness held them all in a fragile bubble of safety. Met her in '63. Boise. I was there buying supplies for the fire tower I was working that summer. She was a librarian. Can you imagine? Me, covered in soot and smelling like pine smoke, trying to check out a book on wilderness survival. She looked at me like I'd grown a second head. He chuckled, the sound strange after so long without laughter. Told me the book was 20 years out of date. Said if I wanted to learn about surviving in the wild, I should just go ask the trees. Jasper's tail thumped once against the stone floor. The dog had heard this story before, many times. But he listened anyway, the way good friends do. I asked her to dinner. She said no. Asked again the next week. No again. Third time, she said yes just to shut me up. We were married 6 months later. Silas's throat tightened. 43 years. Not long enough. Never would have been long enough. The young wolf shifted position, pressing closer. It couldn't understand the words, but it understood tone, understood loss. Its mother lay dying a few feet away. It knew about things being taken too soon. She made me promise not to get bitter. Made me swear I'd keep living even after she was gone. I tried. God knows I tried. But turns out living and just breathing are two different things. He stared into the flames. Then you showed up tonight. Scared and desperate and trusting me for reasons I'll never understand. Gave me something to do besides wait to die. The mother wolf stirred in her sleep, making a soft sound. The pup's ears swiveled toward her, but it didn't move from Silas's side, drawing comfort from both parents now, the one who birthed it and the one who'd saved them both. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, an old man and 3 animals huddled together against the cold and the dark and whatever tomorrow might bring. For now, it was enough. Dawn was still hours away when Jasper's growl pulled Silas from the edge of sleep. The fire had burned down to embers, casting barely enough light to see shapes. The old hound stood at the cave entrance, every muscle tensed. Not the uncertain alert from before. This was recognition. This was enemy at the gates. I know you're in there, Silas. The voice came from somewhere in the darkness beyond the cave mouth. Caleb's voice, roughened by cigarettes and years, but still carrying that same edge of meanness. Saw your fire hours ago. Been waiting for you to settle in, real comfortable. Silas's hand found his rifle. He stayed seated, keeping his silhouette small in the dim firelight. Storm's coming in hard, Caleb. Bad night to be out. Storm's already here. Footsteps crunched closer. Lucky for me, I brought better gear than an old man with a death wish. A pause. You got something that belongs to me. Nothing in this cave belongs to you. Caleb laughed. The sound held no humor. That white pelt's worth 5,000 to the right buyer, maybe more. I've been tracking that wolf for 2 weeks. Set that trap myself. You got no right. Trap's been illegal for 20 years, Silas said. Just like poaching protected species. Just like everything else you've done since I knew you. There it is. Caleb's voice hardened. Still playing ranger? Still thinking you're better than everyone else? You cost me everything, old man. My job, my pension, 6 months in county. Now you're going to cost me this too? The young wolf had pressed itself against Silas's leg, trembling. It sensed danger the way animals always did, reading threats in tone and posture that humans tried to disguise with words. Behind them, the mother wolf remained unconscious. Her breathing labored. She wouldn't survive being moved. Wouldn't survive much of anything if Caleb got his way. "Walk away," Silas said quietly. "Storm will cover your tracks. Nobody needs to know you were here." "Oh, I'm walking away." Metal clicked in the darkness, the unmistakable sound of a rifle bolt sliding home. Just not empty-handed. Caleb stepped into the cave entrance, backlit by the pre-dawn gloom. He held a Winchester at hip level, barrel pointed into the cave. At Silas, at everything. The man looked like he'd aged hard. Face weathered to leather, eyes sunk deep in their sockets. Desperation hung on him like a smell. "Here's how this works," Caleb said. "You put down your rifle, nice and slow. Then you and that mangy dog get out. I do what I came to do, and you get to live. Fair trade." Silas didn't move. His mind raced through options, discarding each one as quickly as it formed. He couldn't outdraw Caleb, couldn't fight him, couldn't run. Age and arthritis had stolen those choices years ago. But 40 years in these mountains had taught him things that youth and desperation couldn't match. Had taught him that the strongest weapon wasn't always the one you could hold in your hands. "You remember Korea?" Silas asked suddenly. Caleb's rifle wavered slightly. "What?" "Korea. You told me about it once. Said you did 2 tours. Said you saw things that stuck with you." Silas kept his voice conversational. "Easy. You ever tell me what those things were?" "The hell does that have to do with anything?" "Just wondering what a man sees that turns him into this." Silas gestured at the cave, at the injured wolf, at the scene Caleb was willing to kill for. "You weren't always like this. I remember that much." Something flickered across Caleb's face. Not quite shame, not quite anger. Something in between that suggested old wounds never properly healed. "You don't know anything about me?" "I know you had a daughter. Emily, right? She'd be what, 35 now?" Silas watched Caleb's grip on the rifle tighten. "She still talked to you?" "Shut up. I know you told me once that being in the woods made you feel clean. Made you feel like the things you'd done didn't matter so much when you were surrounded by something bigger than yourself." Silas leaned forward slightly. "That's still true? Or did you lose that too when you started seeing everything as something to sell?" Caleb's face twisted. "I said shut up. You're going to kill a mother protecting her baby," Silas continued, his voice soft but relentless. "Going to shoot an old man who's trying to do right by something helpless. Then you're going to skin that wolf and sell her hide to someone who'll hang it on a wall like a trophy. That going to make you feel clean, Caleb? That going to help you sleep?" The rifle barrel dropped an inch. Just one. But Silas saw it. "You think I care?" Caleb's voice had lost some of its edge. "You think guilt pays bills?" "No," Silas said. "But it's about all we got left at the end. That and whether we can still look ourselves in the mirror." He paused. "You can still walk away. Storm's getting worse. Take your gear and go. Let this one thing live." For a long moment, Caleb stood frozen. The rifle pointed at something between Silas and the floor. His face worked through emotions too complex to name. Anger and shame and desperation, all fighting for dominance. Then his shoulders sagged, just slightly. The rifle lowered another inch. "You always were a self-righteous son of a bitch," Caleb said, but the venom had drained from his voice. "You know that?" "Yeah," Silas said. "I know." Caleb stood there for another moment, then turned and walked back into the storm. His footsteps faded. The wind swallowed them. He didn't look back. The storm broke 3 hours after Caleb disappeared into the darkness. Silas watched the sky lighten through the cave entrance, gray giving way to pale blue. The wind died to nothing. Snow stopped falling. Idaho mornings after storms always felt like this. Quiet, clean, like the world had been scrubbed raw and left to dry in the cold. The mother wolf had woken shortly before dawn. Her eyes found Silas first, then her pup. She tried to stand, her good leg scrabbling against stone, but the injured leg buckled immediately. She went down hard, a sound of frustration rumbling deep in her chest. Not pain, something worse. The understanding that her body had betrayed her. That the simple act of standing, something she'd done 10,000 times without thought, was now impossible. The young wolf moved to her side, pressing close, offering comfort the only way it knew how. The mother turned her muzzle and licked her pup's face with long, deliberate strokes. Cleaning, reassuring, telling her baby that everything would be all right, even though they both knew it might not be. Silas's chest tightened watching them. He'd seen that same gesture between Margaret and their daughter Sarah, back when Sarah was small and the world still made sense. Before Sarah moved to Seattle and the calls became monthly instead of weekly. Before distance turned family into polite strangers who exchanged Christmas cards and little else. He pushed the memory aside. No time for that kind of thinking now. The mother wolf wouldn't make it down the mountain on 3 legs. Not through snow that came up to her chest in the drifts. Not weak from blood loss and days without food. Silas would have to carry her. All 120 pounds of wild predator that could turn on him the moment fear overrode gratitude. He looked at his coat. Heavy canvas, reinforced with leather at the shoulders. Strong enough to hold a deer carcass when he'd been young enough to hunt. Maybe strong enough for this. Silas took off the coat, immediately feeling the cold knife through his flannel shirt. He laid the coat flat on the cave floor and worked the mother wolf onto it, slow and careful. She watched him with those amber eyes, but didn't fight, didn't snap. Just let herself be moved like she understood, this was her only chance. He tied the coat sleeves together, creating a makeshift sling. The young wolf watched every movement, learning. Jasper moved to the front of the makeshift stretcher, waiting for instructions he'd somehow already figured out. "All right," Silas said. His voice sounded thin in the morning air. "Let's see if 3 old fools can make it down a mountain." The descent took 4 hours. 4 hours of slipping on ice and hauling dead weight and stopping every 10 minutes because Silas's back screamed for mercy and his knees felt like broken glass. Jasper pulled from the front, his teeth gripping the tied sleeves. Silas pushed from behind, his hands numb from cold and strain. The mother wolf stayed still in her canvas cradle, trusting, conserving what little strength she had left. The young pup darted ahead and behind, watching the trail, warning them of loose stones and hidden ice with small sounds that bypassed language. They were a pack now, unlikely and impossible, but real. By the time they reached the tree line, Silas could barely stand. His shirt was soaked through with sweat despite the cold. His hands shook so badly he couldn't make a fist. But they'd made it to flat ground where the snow was shallower and the mother wolf might have a chance to recover without the mountain trying to kill her. Silas untied the coat sleeves and helped the wolf slide free onto a bed of pine needles. She lay there panting, exhausted but alive. Her eyes found his one more time, held them. In that moment, something passed between human and animal that had no name. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition, or just the simple acknowledgement that they'd both survived something that should have killed them. The young wolf approached Silas slowly. It sat in front of him, small and white against the dark trees. Then it lifted one paw and placed it in Silas's open palm. Not the desperate press from before. This was different. Gentle, deliberate, a gesture that felt almost ceremonial. Silas's throat closed. Tears he didn't know he had left burned behind his eyes. The wolf's paw was warm against his cold skin, light as a whisper, heavy as forgiveness. "You take care of her," Silas said. His voice cracked. "You hear me? You stay close, and you keep her safe." The young wolf pulled its paw back and touched its nose to Silas's hand. Once, twice, sealing a promise that neither of them could speak, but both understood. Then it turned and curled against its mother, and Silas knew it was time to go. He stood on legs that barely worked, pulled his coat back on, and looked at them one last time. Mother and pup, broken and whole, together. "Come on, Jasper," he said quietly. "Let's go home." They walked back through the forest, old man and old dog, and neither one looked back. Spring came to Idaho the way it always did. Slowly at first, then all at once. The snow retreated up the mountainsides, leaving behind mud and new grass and the smell of earth waking from a long sleep. Wildflowers pushed through the thaw in defiant splashes of color. Purple lupin, yellow balsam root, Indian paintbrush, the color of fire. Silas sat on his porch in the same chair he'd occupied for 40 years. The wood had worn smooth under his hands, shaped by decades of morning coffee and evening whiskey and all the quiet hours in between. He looked older now. The winter had taken something from him that spring couldn't quite give back. His movements were slower, his breathing more labored. But his eyes had changed. The dead flatness that had haunted them for 3 years was gone. Jasper lay at his feet, gray muzzle resting on paws that barely worked anymore. The old dog spent most of his time sleeping now, dreaming whatever dreams old dogs had. Chasing rabbits through fields that only existed in memory. Running on legs that no longer hurt. Silas reached for the binoculars on the table beside him. The same ones he'd used for 40 years to watch elk and eagles and the changing face of the Sawtooth Mountains. His hands shook as he raised them to his eyes, age and arthritis making even simple tasks difficult. But he managed. He scanned the high country, looking for something he'd been looking for every morning since the snow melted. At first there'd been nothing. Just empty rock and sparse trees and the slow greening of the alpine meadows. He'd told himself not to expect anything. Told himself that wild things didn't remember kindness the way humans wanted them to. That he'd done what he could, and that had to be enough. Then, 3 weeks ago, he'd seen them. The movement caught his eye first. 2 white shapes moving across the highest ridge, stark against the dark stone. Silas adjusted the focus, his heart suddenly hammering in his chest, with an intensity that had nothing to do with his failing health. There, the mother wolf, leading the way along a game trail that hugged the cliff edge. Her gait was different now, a hitch in her stride where the injured leg took weight. But she moved with purpose, with strength. The limp didn't slow her, didn't make her any less magnificent. Behind her, the young wolf, not so young anymore. Bigger now, filled out with spring hunting and the confidence that came from surviving a winter that should have killed them both. It matched its mother's pace, staying close, but not too close. Letting her lead, but ready to help if she faltered. They stopped on the highest point of the ridge. 2 white wolves silhouetted against the morning sky like something out of legend. The mother lifted her muzzle, and Silas knew, even from this distance, that she was testing the wind, reading the air for danger and opportunity and all the information that humans had forgotten how to sense. Then her head turned. looked down the mountain, looked directly at Silas's cabin, even though it was miles away and mostly hidden by trees. Silas lowered the binoculars, his hands trembling. Not from age now, from something else. She knew. Somehow, across all that distance, she knew he was watching. Knew he thought about them. Knew he checked the ridges every morning, hoping for a glimpse of white fur against gray stone. Movement on the porch caught his attention. Something at the top of the steps that hadn't been there when he'd come out with his coffee. Silas stood, his joints protesting, and walked the few feet to investigate. A branch lay across the weathered boards, fresh-cut willow with catkins just beginning to bloom. Beside it, a single feather. Not from any bird Silas recognized immediately. Too large for a raven, too white for an eagle. He picked it up carefully, turning it in the morning light. Snowy owl, rare as winter lightning in these mountains. The kind of thing you might see once in a lifetime if you were lucky. The kind of gift that couldn't be coincidence. They'd been here, sometime in the night while he slept, brought him this small offering and left it where he'd find it. Proof that wild things did remember. That kindness echoed in ways that went deeper than words or reason. Silas sat back down, the feather and willow branch cradled in his lap. Tears tracked down his weathered face. He didn't bother wiping them away. He'd cried more in the last 4 months than in the 3 years since Margaret's death. Found that he didn't mind anymore. That tears were just another way of feeling, and feeling anything at all was better than the numbness that had consumed him. He raised the binoculars one more time. The wolves were still there on the ridge, still watching. The mother sat now, regal despite her injury. The young one stood beside her, already nearly as large. They looked like queens surveying their kingdom, survivors who'd earned their place in these mountains through pain and persistence, and the stubborn refusal to die when dying would have been easier. Silas smiled. The expression felt strange on his face, muscles unused to the movement. But it felt right too. Real in a way. Nothing had felt real in a very long time. He wasn't alone. That was the truth of it. The simple, impossible truth. He had family out there in the wildest parts of Idaho. Family that spoke a different language and walked on 4 legs instead of 2, but understood him better than most humans ever had. The wolves turned away from the ridge, heading deeper into the high country where humans couldn't follow. Where they belonged. But they'd be back. Silas knew that now. Knew he'd see them again on some future morning, and they'd leave him small gifts to remind him that he mattered. That what he'd done mattered. That even broken things could heal if given enough time and care. Jasper stirred at his feet, lifting his gray head to look at Silas. The old dog's tail thumped once against the porch boards. A question and an answer all at once. "Yeah," Silas said softly, reaching down to scratch behind Jasper's ears. "We're going to be all right." The sun climbed higher. Spring continued its slow work of transformation, and on a porch in the Idaho wilderness, an old man sat with a feather in his hands and hope in his heart, finally understanding that loneliness was just another trap you could choose to escape from, if you were willing to trust something wild enough to show you the way. Sometimes the most broken souls find each other in the strangest places. Silas found his family on a frozen mountain. Where did you find yours? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Have you ever saved an animal that ended up saving you right back? Or maybe you've experienced that moment when a wild creature trusted you with something precious. Share it with us. This community loves hearing about the connections that remind us we're not as alone as we think. And if this story touched your heart, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. because there are more stories like Silas's waiting to be told. Stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things when life gave them a choice between walking away and showing up. Stories that remind us it's never too late to matter. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one.